A horse's hooves thundered against the cobbled streets, echoing like war drums through London's choking summer air. Behind the cart, lashed and crumpled, William Wallace, once a general, once a legend, was bound by rawhide and iron. His ankles were shattered, his back streaked with lash marks, but it was the dragging that undid him. For miles his half-living body was pulled through refuse and sewage, his skin sloughing off in ribbons, bones jarring against the road, the groan of iron wheels drowned by the jeering of the mob. Flies collected at the corners of his lips where blood mingled with spit. His eyes, sunken half-blind from starvation, blinked against the dust. A small girl laughed and threw a piece of spoiled bread. It struck his brow and stuck. This was Smithfield, and the fire had already been lit. Before the execution ever truly began, his body had been reduced to pulp. Blood pooled behind the cart in a serpentine trail, mixing with animal offal fragments of discarded meat and the foul waste of the market. He was being taken not to die, but to be dismembered alive, ceremonially, slowly, symbolically. Every gesture of the ritual was designed not just to kill, but to destroy memory. This was no simple punishment. It was a political exorcism. The scaffold rose like a wooden altar at the center of the square, crowned with iron hooks and chains. There was no mistaking it for justice. This was vengeance, masquerading as law. One of the guards adjusted the rope around Wallace's throat and spat in his face. "For your crown of thistles," he said, sneering. "A king of beasts are ye. Let's see what kind of king bleeds." The crowd was immense. Men, women, children, peddlers of trinkets and pies elbowed for space. Some shouted, others sang. A few whispered prayers not for Wallace, but for the sanctity of empire. They had come to see a monster unmade. Few remembered the man. Fewer remembered why he had fought. A priest approached with a wooden cross held aloft. The breeze caught his robe and lifted the hem like a funeral banner. He leaned in, murmuring the final rites in Latin. Wallace coughed. What came out was more air than sound, a rattle deep from the throat. The executioner stepped forward, face obscured by a hood hands already red from the morning's work. He inspected the prisoner with the detachment of a butcher at market. The tools of disassembly were laid in neat order hooks, blades, tongs, chains, and fire. Each would have its moment. Each had been polished for the occasion. A murmur passed through the crowd. Some turned away. One nobleman fainted when he saw the ropes tighten and the cart jolt forward again. Wallace, still half-conscious, was pulled upright, hanging now by the throat, twitching like a caught animal, limbs jerking in spasms. But this was not to be the end. He was cut down before death could claim him. Air rushed back into his lungs like fire. His mouth opened in a silent scream. A child in the front row cried. The body of William Wallace, bloodied and ragged, still breathed. And that was the point. Death for him would come inch by inch. A man in the crowd muttered, "This is no execution. This is theater." And indeed it was. From the platform, smoke curled around the frame. The scent of burning oak mingled with the stink of seared flesh from earlier victims. The air thickened with dread. Behind the scaffold in the alleyways and shadows, other prisoners waited their turn, silent witnesses to the ritual. Wallace lifted his head. Even now, even broken, he did not cry out. Even now there was something in his eyes the crowd could not kill. Something defiant. Something that would need to be carved out. The flames crackled louder, waiting. If you enjoy immersive history, told with depth and detail, like this video, and subscribe for more. The story had only begun. The cell was no larger than a butcher's stall. Stone on all four sides, wet from seepage and the breath of rats. It stank of mildew piss and flesh left too long to rot. In the far corner, a bucket. In the other chains, still slick with the last man's blood. Here they did not hang their prisoners from ceilings or press them in iron maidens. They broke them slowly with silence and time. William Wallace had not spoken in days. It wasn't just that his tongue was swollen from thirst, or that the meat of his jaw throbbed from beatings. It was language itself evacuated from him like breath from a corpse. Every time he tried to form a word, the memory of it fled. His Gaelic once sung like fire across battlefields had been spat from him. His English was taken too turned against him in the mouths of snickering guards who mocked his accent with barbed glee. "You still think in freedom?" one of them asked on the third night. "We'll teach you how to think in chains." They fed him just enough to keep him conscious. A crust of sour bread, a ladle of fetid broth, sometimes moldy, sometimes not. It didn't matter. He swallowed in silence. Hunger had become a rhythm, a pulse that throbbed behind his eyes, that whispered in his belly like a second voice. Starvation had its own language, its own philosophy. The walls moved at night. He heard them, scratching, breathing, sometimes chanting, not from within, but as if the stone itself remembered what had happened here. Tortured monks, burned women, flayed rebels. It spoke to him in the rattle of chains and the drip of water. The cell knew how to unmake a man. He no longer counted the days. Time was a mercy for those who still had tomorrows. Instead, he marked each sunrise, not with hope, but with the sickly yellow light that bled through the single slit in the wall, casting a line across his bruised chest, like the blade of a future executioner. Sleep there was none. They made sure of that. Every few hours a guard would slam the iron door open and beat the floor with a torch stick. No questions, no warnings, just the eruption of firelight and noise to jolt him awake, keep the fear raw and uninterrupted. He'd flinch sometimes, scream not out of fear, but because the silence before had allowed the memory of freedom to crawl back into his skull, and the sound shattered it. Once they dragged in a boy, a Scottish boy, young maybe 10, naked, shivering, bruises on his back. The guards laughed and said, "Your bastard son. Come to die with Daddy." Wallace blinked, stared. He did not know the child, but the look in the boy's eyes made him believe for one cruel instant that maybe it was true. Maybe he had left a seed behind in some village. Maybe that boy's name was carved into the world, like a forgotten prayer. Then they took the child away, screaming. They brought him back the next day, mute, bleeding, unconscious. Wallace said nothing. What words could hold this? What syllables did grief have in chains? His name had become a curse, not just to the English, but to the Scottish lords who had once pledged loyalty, then sold it for coin and mercy. Letters came delivered by gloved hands, papal decrees, royal condemnations. They addressed him as William the Traitor, the murderer of York, the false guardian. One even referred to him only as it. He read none of them, but he burned each in his memory. At night he sometimes saw her, Marion, not as she had died throat-cut in reprisal, but as she had been laughing in the morning light, her hands muddy from planting her eyes defiant even then. She said nothing, just watched. Her silence was heavier than the guards' laughter. Once they offered him a deal. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself, cloaked in white, stepped into the cell like a wraith. He brought incense and wine and an offer. Confess, kneel, swear fealty to Edward as God's chosen. Accept the crown of mercy. You'll die, yes, but with a priest's hand and a clean blade. Perhaps even a burial. Wallace looked up, lips cracked. And for the first time in days he spoke. "Is your God not ashamed?" It was the only sentence he would speak that week. The priest said nothing, only crossed himself and left muttering, "The devil speaks Scotch." The following morning they flayed the bottoms of Wallace's feet and forced him to stand for hours on salt-soaked boards. When he collapsed, they poured boiling water over his back to wake him. They didn't want his confession. They wanted his soul to break first. And in that cell, no name, no language, no sleep, no son, no wife, no country. He felt the edge of oblivion, not death, but dissolution. To be alive and not exist. To breathe and yet be forgotten. The worst part, he could feel it working. That was the cruelty of it all. Not the pain. The erasure. They dressed him in rags stitched from stolen symbols, scraps of tartan and linen, dirtied with soot, and blood layered like a mock coronation robe. Across his shoulders, they draped a shredded banner of St. Andrew, torn from the hands of a fallen comrade at Falkirk. His feet, raw and ulcered, dragged behind him as he was lifted upright, lashed to a post affixed to a rolling plank, dragged by 4 convicts promised their freedom in exchange for partaking in this procession of state vengeance. Above his brow, they set the crown. It was no golden circlet, no token of glory. It was a halo of twisted iron spikes and blacksmith nails, heated just enough to sear the skin on contact before cooling against his scalp. Blood ran down his temples in slow rivulets, joining the crimson lines already marking his cheeks from beatings. One eye was nearly swollen shut. His lips had cracked open from days of dryness. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. Each exhale a labor, each inhale a wheeze through splintered ribs. The crowd gathered at every corner. London had turned the parade of the dying into ritual. The clanging of bells mixed with the high-pitched piping of children's flutes, discordant and wild. Vendors moved through the masses selling sweetmeats and roasted chestnuts. From balconies above, noblemen and clergy peered through curtained windows, watching from safe distances as the man once called Guardian of Scotland was paraded like a broken god. A woman in the front row leaned forward and hissed, "Is this your freedom?" A boy threw a stone. It struck Wallace's shoulder and he groaned. The crowd cheered. They called it the March of Shame, but it was far more calculated than that. This was not humiliation. It was inversion. Wallace had worn no crown in life. He had claimed no throne. Yet they crowned him now so that it could be torn from him symbolically. So the fire could melt it. So the crowd could spit on it. So the memory of kingship could be forged in mockery and ash. One man threw rotten meat. Another flung a chamber pot. Children followed giggling, holding up crude drawings, pigs in kilts, Scots with antlers, Wallace's face sketched with a noose around the neck. All of it approved, all of it allowed. The public was not merely witness, it was participant. And he, the central figure, bound and bloodied, remained silent. Not defiant, not broken, just there. The eyes of a dead man inside a breathing body. He passed the church of St. Bartholomew. The monks rang a bell as he was dragged past. Not for him. For the souls of those lost to heresy, Wallace's name would not be spoken in prayer, only in mockery, only in caution. See what becomes of rebels, a mother told her child. This is what happens to men who forget who their king is. Wallace's legs gave out near the Fleet River crossing. His body slumped half-hanging from the plank face, dragging across the timber. The iron crown shifted, slicing a deeper groove into his scalp. Blood and filth pooled in his beard. One of the convicts paused. For a moment the man looked down, not with contempt, but with something quieter. Pity, perhaps. Recognition. Then he kept walking. A soldier on horseback barked, "Lift the traitor's head." The people want to see the monster. Wallace's hair was yanked back. His face was hoisted into view. There was no monster in those eyes, just salt and sweat and time. He passed under Traitor's Gate, its black iron mouth yawning like a tomb. Ravens circled overhead. A white cloth was tied to the scaffold beams ahead, meant to mimic a royal standard. But it was already stained with old gore flapping like skin in the wind. There were no trumpets, no drums, just the crunch of wooden wheels and the endless murmur of hatred. The crown slipped as he was hauled toward the steps of the scaffold, and one of the executioners, grinning, toothless, righted it, pressing it back down into his torn scalp with both hands. There he said, mock reverent, our king of corpses. Some in the crowd laughed. Others looked away. A woman clutched her rosary. Her lips moved, but no prayer escaped. Only silence. Wallace lifted his head one last time, not toward the mob, not toward the altar where death would unfold, but toward the sky, gray, indifferent, distant. The smoke of the city curled upward, thin as thread toward clouds too high to notice. He had worn no true crown in life, but they gave him one now, not out of honor, but fear, because symbols are louder than swords. And they needed the world to see a broken man in a crown to convince themselves that kingship itself had died with him. The hall was cavernous, too large for the truths it pretended to contain. Westminster's vaulted ceiling loomed above, like a judgmental god, echoing each footfall, each whisper, each lie. On this day, the stones bore witness not to justice, but to theater. They had rehearsed this performance already. The lines were written. The actors were in place. All that remained was the spectacle of a man being erased in public, his voice carved out before the flesh followed. They brought Wallace in on a litter body, barely functioning iron crown still crusted with dried blood. He did not walk to his trial. He was delivered to it like meat. 2 guards flanked him, not to protect the court from the accused, but to keep his head upright. His legs no longer bent, his mouth no longer opened. They feared his voice more than his sword. A herald stood and began to read. William Wallace, traitor to the crown, murderer of innocents and enemy of God. The titles spilled forth like bile, scroll after scroll, unrolled for dramatic effect. Each word dripped with rehearsed outrage. The audience, carefully curated from London's loyal elite, responded on cue. Gasps at the mention of York. Murmurs at the burning of Lanark. Cheers when the herald declared him the most savage of rebels. Wallace said nothing. He was not asked to. There would be no defense, no counsel, no cross-examination. Only the ritual humiliation of being spoken about, dissected like a corpse, laid open before it had even stopped breathing. The judge, a bloated man, with a wine-pocked face, occasionally dabbed at his brow with a scented cloth. His robes were spotless. His eyes never once met Wallace's. A monk stood behind the bench, holding a golden cross and muttering rote prayers, not of mercy, but of imperial thanksgiving. Another gesture in this hollow mass. They accused Wallace of treason. Treason. As if he had ever sworn loyalty to Edward. As if a man born beyond the Tweed owed submission to a foreign king simply because England said so. As if blood and land could be so easily purchased by parchment and crown. He tried once to speak. A single syllable cracked from his throat, dry as rust. The judge banged the staff and snarled, "Silence, beast, you have no right to speak in the court of your betters." The gallery laughed. A poet paid by the crown stood and read a verse mocking Wallace's pretensions to nobility. He described the rebel's body as a tapestry of treason, marked with the scars of sin. The words were meant to be cutting, but they were met only by the flat indifference of Wallace's stare. He did not blink. He did not look away. He was no longer there, not truly. His body was in the hall, but his soul had already retreated to quieter places. The memory of wind across the highlands of Marion's laugh by the fire of rain on steel and the cry of war pipes. The present had no claim on him any more. The trial concluded as it had begun, with a performance of moral superiority, dressed in red velvet and legal jargon. The sentence, of course, was already known. William Wallace. "You shall be drawn from the Tower to Smithfield," the judge intoned, "where you shall be hanged by the neck, but not until death. Your entrails shall be removed, your genitals severed, your heart cut out and burned. Your head shall be struck from your shoulders and displayed upon London Bridge, your body quartered and sent to Newcastle Barrack, Perth, and Stirling, to be a warning to all who would follow in your path." A pause. As a mercy, the judge added with mock gravity, "Your soul will be commended to God." The hall applauded, not as a court of law, but as an audience satisfied with its conclusion. Wallace's lips twitched. Not a smile, not a grimace, just the barest movement, as though the ghost of a word had tried and failed to form. He was carried out backwards so the crowd could look into his face as he passed. Some spit, some whispered blessings. One woman reached forward and touched his foot as if it were relic. A soldier cuffed her away. Behind him the court resumed its business: land disputes, inheritance petitions, a noble's complaint about a flooded cellar. The machinery of empire rolled on unbothered, unchanged. It had eaten Wallace and would digest him in the coming days, scatter his body like seeds, rewrite his name as curse. He would not speak again. And that was the point. The execution would not begin at the scaffold. It had already begun here in this room, where truth had been gagged and history dipped in ash. Where a man had been declared a monster, not because he was one, but because it was easier than hearing what he had to say. They called it drawing, but the term was clean, too clean. What happened to Wallace next was not mechanical, not procedural. It was a choreography of agony scripted by men who understood the psychological weight of spectacle. London was not content with his death. It wanted to rehearse it, extend it, savor it like a sermon performed in flesh. The execution ground at Smithfield was packed, not just with commoners. Nobles had arrived early to claim the best vantage points. The scaffold had been freshly constructed, taller than usual, almost ceremonial. It creaked under the weight of its ornamentation banners, bearing Edward's sigil floral wreaths, draped in mockery pikes, lined with the heads of lesser men who had died, quieter deaths. And in the center, the hanging post, tall and deliberate, its rope braided thick like the spine of a beast. Wallace was dragged across the blood-stained platform. His flesh was a canvas of bruises, lashes, punctures. His knees no longer held weight. His right shoulder had dislocated during transport, hanging loosely now like dead wood. A priest trailed behind, mumbling prayers that were neither heard nor wanted. He did not offer comfort. He did not even touch the condemned. His presence was ornamental, another relic of Holy Empire. The executioner approached. He was masked, but not for anonymity. The hood was crimson, stitched with golden thread. A costume. He slipped the noose around Wallace's neck, tightened it, stepped back. The signal was given. The platform beneath his feet dropped. Wallace rose not upward, but into a different kind of silence. The rope bit into his windpipe, cutting air, forcing blood into his brain. His legs kicked once, twice, then fell still. His mouth opened not in a scream, but in a void, a breath that never came. The crowd roared, but then they cut him down. Not dead. Not yet. His body crumpled to the boards with a sound like wet wood. His chest heaved violently, lungs dragging in air as if they had forgotten how to breathe. Blood vessels burst in his eyes. He did not speak, could not. His tongue lolled uselessly. Saliva and bile streamed from his lips. 2 guards lifted him by the arms. The executioner examined his face. Still conscious. Good. They hanged him again, this time shorter. Enough to bring the shimmer of unconsciousness, but not the comfort of oblivion. His body convulsed. His hands clawed at nothing. The rope twisted, creaked, sang. Again he was cut down. This cycle would repeat. Hang, collapse, revive. 3 times in total. A trinity of torment. It was a ritual designed not for efficiency, but for presence, to give the crowd a sense that justice was not just served, but enacted so thoroughly that they could taste it in the air, feel it in the soles of their feet. This was not death. This was a liturgy. At one point Wallace's eye rolled back, showing only the whites. A woman fainted. A man vomited. The priest stepped forward as if to speak, then reconsidered. No prayer could sanctify this. No God could claim it. The executioner leaned down and whispered something into Wallace's ear. No one heard it. No one asked. But some swore they saw the faintest twitch at the corner of Wallace's mouth. Not laughter, not pain, something harder to name. Defiance, maybe. Or the memory of it. The rope was cut. Wallace fell for the last time. He landed on his side, breathing. Barely. And now the real work could begin. The man was still alive, and the crowd leaned forward, hungry to watch the next layers of meaning be flayed from him. They were not here for a death. They were here for a transformation, from body to message, from man to warning, from rebel to ash. The blade was not clean. It had already been used that morning on 2 thieves and a deserter. It bore their residue flesh-blood hair and something deeper, something spiritual. Tools remember things, and this one had been baptized in suffering. Wallace lay motionless on the boards, his body heaving in shallow waves. His chest rose and fell like a dying animal's, each breath a struggle, each breath a betrayal. He was alive. That was the condition of this next act. He had to be alive. The executioner stepped forward. He was no longer masked. For this part, the performance required a face that could smile. He knelt beside Wallace and slid a gloved hand across the belly. The skin was blistered from boiling water, the muscles spasming in random, exhausted pulses. The knife entered without resistance. There was no scream, just a ripple of movement, like a tremor through mud. The blade opened the abdomen slowly, from navel to breastbone. The wound spread like a mouth silent, but gaping. A woman in the front row collapsed. A man covered his son's eyes. The priest turned away. Steam rose from the cut. The scent followed warm copper intestinal rot, the unmistakable reek of something sacred being violated. The crowd, so eager minutes before, fell into a tense, aching quiet. Then the executioner reached in. Both hands. With practiced ease, he drew out Wallace's intestines, looping them one by one, like butchered sausages onto a wooden bowl lined with straw. Still warm, still slick. He held them high, and the crowd gasped. This was no longer a man. This was instruction, a warning etched in viscera. Here, the executioner bellowed, is where treason lives, in the gut of a traitor. He slammed the organs into the fire pit. Flames roared, fat sizzled. A thick, nauseating smoke coiled into the summer air. The skin around Wallace's mouth twitched. His eyes, astonishingly, were open. Not focused, not lucid, but open. Watching. Some said later that he blinked twice as his intestines were burned. Some said he wept. Others claimed they saw no movement at all, that his soul had already left, and only a shell remained. But those close enough to the scaffold knew better. He was still inside that body. Still trapped. Still suffering. They cut away his genitals next. That part was not spoken of later. It was too much even for the chroniclers. A few scribes referenced it obliquely. His virility unmade the fire, consumed the seeds of rebellion. One bishop refused to record it at all, but the crowd remembered, the mothers especially. They knew what it meant to erase a man so completely that not even the idea of his legacy could remain. To burn not only his body, but the possibility of future children. It was not death. It was obliteration. Wallace's hands, bound with leather cords, twitched once. The executioner wiped his blade on the corpse of a goat they had slaughtered as part of the ritual. The symbolism was thick. The scapegoat, the rebel king, the animal sacrificed to appease empire. He turned back to Wallace and reached deeper. The heart would come next. But not yet. The fire needed time to rise. The executioner stood and addressed the crowd. His voice rang out across the square like a sermon. Thus dies the ambition of traitors. Thus perishes the enemy of our God, anointed king. Let none rise again from the land of Scotland without remembering this moment. But no one cheered. Not anymore. What had begun as a bloodlust spectacle had turned. The smell, the silence, the way Wallace's open eyes refused to die. It haunted them. In that moment, many wished for it to end, even those who hated him. But it wouldn't end. Not yet. They needed the heart. The final piece. The truth of this death was not in its pain. It was in its duration. Because what empire fears most is not rebellion. It is memory. So they had to make the memory unbearable, unrepeatable. So grotesque that no one would dare wear the name Wallace again. So bloody that even whispering his cause would taste like bile. And still he did not die. His heart continued to beat. The fire was ready. The heart was not. It beat still somewhere behind the torn flesh of Wallace's ribs, thudding slow and uneven, like a drum losing its rhythm. Blood leaked in fits and starts from the open cavity, its color darkening to a syrupy black. It did not gush. It oozed, a kind of weeping. Even in this, his body clung to dignity, refusing to die on command, denying the performance a clean curtain fall. The executioner reached in again, arm slick to the elbow. He groped upward through cords of sinew and collapsing lungs. Found it. A sudden lurch, Wallace's chest spasmed. Then stillness. The heart emerged. It was smaller than the crowd expected, grayed with trauma. It quivered once in the open air, as if confused by its own visibility. The executioner raised it aloft, trembling slightly now, not from effort, but awe. He turned to the crowd. Here beats no more the will of rebellion, and threw it into the fire. It hissed, crackled, popped, and turned to smoke. Some say Wallace saw it, that his eye twitched or that a tear fell just before it turned to ash. Others believe he was already gone, that his soul had fled with the first blade. But even skeptics agree in that moment the scaffold felt holy, not divine, but sacred in its violence. A ritual space where empire made its point not with parchment, but with bone. The execution was not yet finished, not in the eyes of the crown. He had been judged. He had been unmade. Now he would be erased. A man is not a body. A man is a shape, a boundary in space. To destroy him utterly, they had to take even that away. They laid Wallace's remains on the block, limbs stretched unnaturally. One soldier held the left leg, another the right arm. A third, drunk on heat and adrenaline, sang an old marching song as the cleaver was prepared. The first limb came off clean. The next did not. The blade stuck between sinew and bone. It took 3 tries to finish. By the 4th, the executioner no longer looked into Wallace's face. He worked as a butcher would, quick-practiced, efficient. The crowd no longer watched with hunger. Now, it was horror. Now, it was fatigue. When the work was done, Wallace's body had become 4 separate objects, each wrapped in coarse burlap dripping through the cloth. Each one marked with a wax seal, one for Newcastle, one for Berwick, one for Stirling, one for Perth. They would be displayed on spikes above gates, on pikes beside bridges. Flies would gather. Crows would perch. Children would throw stones and run away laughing, and none of them would see a man. Only a warning. The head was last. The severing was mercifully swift compared to what had come before. A single stroke. Clean. The face did not contort. It simply was eyes half open, jaw slack beard, singed mouth slightly parted as though caught in the middle of a final word. Never spoken. The head was dipped in tar to preserve it, then hoisted high above London Bridge, and left to rot. Wind tore through the city that night, lifting smoke and ash from Smithfield and carrying it across rooftops and steeples. Some said the scent of the burning heart lingered in the air for days. Others claimed that birds refused to fly over the scaffold for a week. But the machinery did not stop. By morning, a new scaffold was built, a new prisoner processed, a new name added to the ledger. The executioner was paid in coin and ale. The scribes recorded the death as justified. The priests gave thanks. The streets were swept. Only the blood remained deep in the wood beneath the cracks of the scaffold where no sun reached. A memory pressed into grain, and in 4 cities at 4 gates, Wallace's limbs hung like punctuation marks. The sentence was clear: never again. But history is not stone. It is breath. It moves. And the heart they burned did not stay buried. The death was supposed to end him. Not just the man, not just the body, but the idea. That was the point of it all. The ritual, the horror, the careful choreography of dismemberment. Wallace wasn't to be martyred. He was to be deleted, reduced to a grotesque fable whispered in border villages. A cautionary tale about what happens when you defy the crown. But myths are born in ash. And something went wrong. Not in the execution every command had been followed. Every inch of suffering inflicted. Every part of him burned, chopped, scattered, displayed. They had destroyed his voice. They had scattered his bones across the map. But in doing so, they turned him into something far more dangerous than a rebel. They made him remembered. It began quietly. A ballad hummed by a widow outside Stirling, a carved initial on a prison wall, children calling one another Wallace as they fought with sticks near the riverside. In Newcastle they found his leg half devoured by crows. A soldier said it looked as though it were pointing north. They laughed. Then they stopped laughing. Because the more they tried to forget him, the more people remembered. Not the facts, not the trials or titles, but the feeling. That someone had once stood before the machine and said no. That someone had chosen fire over silence. The Empire tried to reframe him, called him a butcher, a rogue, a madman. They burned poems about him, banned songs, executed minstrels who dared sing his name. But the tune lingered, in taverns, in fields, in dreams. They failed to understand one thing. When you tear a man apart limb by limb, and each piece continues to speak, what you've created is not erasure. It is resonance. A body cut into 4 becomes 4 memories. A heart burned becomes legend. A face tarred and nailed to a bridge becomes a shrine. Even his enemies began to admire the silhouette. There are no complete portraits of Wallace, no written record in his own hand. And yet we remember the angles of his defiance, the way he stood, the way he died. We fill in the gaps with reverence and rage, because deep down, we know no man suffers like that for nothing. His grave does not exist. His remains have long since returned to the soil, carried on the wind, swallowed by time. But that was the last mistake England made. They assumed legacy requires a tomb. It doesn't. It requires a witness. And there were thousands. There were those in the crowd who never forgot the way his eyes stayed open, the way the fire refused to cleanse him, the way the silence after his heart was burned was heavier than all the cheering before. They built cathedrals to kings, but Wallace's altar was the scaffold, a place where truth and brutality collided, and something holy flickered just for a moment in blood and smoke. And centuries later, we still return to it. Not to mourn, but to listen. Because every execution tells 2 stories. One written by power, polished, recorded, enshrined in law. And one remembered by the broken sung in fragments half lost, but never extinguished. William Wallace died like a dog, so they said. But they forget. Dogs return to the house that beat them. And sometimes they come back with teeth. All power crumbles at the edge of the grave. But legends outlive the scaffold, and scream louder than the silence they were meant to become. History is often written in ink, but remembered in blood. The execution of William Wallace was not an ending, it was an inscription, not on stone, not on scrolls, but in the collective memory of those who saw and those who heard. What they tried to silence became louder in death. What they tried to shame became sacred in memory. He left no tomb, no crown, no last words carved in marble, only echoes. And yet there is something in his death that lingers not because it was rare, but because it was designed, because it reminds us what power fears most, not armies, not swords, but meaning. Wallace had no throne. He had no dynasty, only a refusal, and that was enough. Today, the tools of empire have changed. They no longer burn bodies on scaffolds or scatter limbs across the land. They erase in subtler ways through silence, distraction, and rewritten narratives. But the lesson remains. Every age has its Smithfield. Every system has its Wallace. The question is not who will rise, it is who will watch. Because the ones who stand by, the ones who look away, become the bricks in the next scaffold. So remember what you saw today, not just the agony, but the dignity within it, the choice to be torn apart rather than kneel, the courage to leave behind nothing and still be remembered. And as long as one voice speaks his name, even in a whisper, even in the dark, they failed.